Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name's John Marshall, and I have the pleasure of serving as president here at CMU, joined by a couple of friends and colleagues. Holly Oberle is an assistant professor of political science who specializes in comparative politics and foreign policy. Dr. Oberle teaches a variety of coursework and has lived overseas in, I'll let you describe it, but a lot of different countries, and brings really a global perspective to her work here at CMU. Professor Olga Grisak. Olga is an assistant professor of radiologic technology and teaches specifically in the radiologic technology program. Hails originally from Ukraine, which of course is the topic of conversation today. And Olga, you have family that lives in Lviv, as I understand it. I wonder if you might start our conversation today by just sharing a little bit about your home and what that looks like, as we've all seen Ukraine pop into the headlines, but of course, but we don't have a great sense, maybe all of us, for what that geography and the culture and that looks like, and share with us a little bit, maybe if you would, about your home.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for having me here. So yes, my family and my husband's family, they all in Lviv. Lviv is the biggest city in the western Ukraine. It is primarily Ukrainian-speaking city, about 800,000 people. And we've been very fortunate because it hasn't been too bad in that part of the country. It has been a complete disbelief at the very beginning, and I remember talking to my mom the day the war started. In the morning, it was evening by her time, and I was asking her, we have really bad news. Could you at least get some, emergency supply of food? And she's like, nothing's gonna happen. You can't imagine somebody would be bombing Kiev. And that night, it was evening here and it was morning there. That's how it started. So they were absolutely caught by surprise that would happen. But geographically, we have been very lucky because there have been some bombing in Lviv, and there have been some people who were killed by those bombing, but not in the numbers nearly that we've seen in the east part of the country. Lviv is a cultural center. It has 5 major universities. It has a very deep Ukrainian traditions and museums, and one of the leading Ukrainian philosophers and people who kind of define Ukrainian identity. They definitely kind of originated from that part of the country. So there's a very strong pro-Western sentiment in this part of the country. And at this point, Lviv has been accepting refugees in large numbers. Many of them stay for a few days, get kind of their things in order, and then leave for Poland or other countries in Europe. Many of them stay, so they started building those kind of modulars for families. But it's primarily elderly women and children. And they actually started online schools for children who relocated from eastern part of the country. It hasn't been any major disruption in terms of food or water or electricity. They have internet connection, everything they need at this point, but they still live in the constant kind of air sirens situation where it can happen. I get those notifications on my phone because sometimes my in-laws don't hear them, and I make sure that they, at least go to the safe part of the apartment. So it is still constantly on their mind, but we can't compare what's going on in Lviv with what's going on in, let's say, Mariupol or in the eastern part. So we're very, very lucky, if you can say it, in this situation.
Olga, tell us a little more about, you have family there. Is that extended family? Who all is in that area?
My parents, my granddad, grandfather, my nephew, and then my husband's parents are there.
So you have family throughout that, and it sounds like this has just been a surreal experience because you're communicating with them periodically, sounds like, but also we're all consuming this in the news and online, and I just can't imagine it sounds like a really challenging situation for your family.
It is, because you don't know what's going to happen. Everyone was really worried about Monday because it was the victory day in Russia, and we were worried that they would do something specifically in Lviv, because they all very much against that part of the country, and they think it needs to be bombed and destroyed, according to some of their propaganda hosts on their state TV. But it is, people try to survive, people try to carry on, people try to help refugees, even in our families. Our relatives from Kiev have been staying with my family. My in-laws been hosting refugees for a few days and helping them get to the railroad station, get them like food supplies. But neither of them are planning on leaving, because when you have older people, travel is something that is very scary. And we have, my grandfather is 93, so it's unrealistic to try to move him unless it absolutely a very dangerous situation, because we have the ability, we would meet them, at the Polish border, but everyone refused.
So Olga, in terms of geography, Lviv is how far away from Kiev?
About 5-6 hours by car. Yeah, cannot tell you in miles exactly.
Yeah, well, we can kind of gauge that. I think sometimes in the States we have a hard time gauging some of that geography. I want to bring Dr. Oberle into this conversation. You've studied this work throughout that region, the Soviet history, et cetera. And Olga just raised this question around some of the propaganda that's coming out of Russia that kind of harkens back to maybe some of that Soviet era experience. Holly, as you've watched this unfold, talk to us a little bit about the geopolitics that you've reflected on through that region and some of the precursors leading up to this.
Sure. So I think one of the main things that I teach, especially in my foreign policy classes, is about perception. And I think in the West, particularly in the United States, when the Cold War ended, that's the language that we use. The Cold War ended. But I think especially in Russia, and especially in kind of Putin's orbit, the Cold War didn't end. And so I think one really important way to try to understand this from a political perspective is just that. I think a lot of Westerners and Americans, and quite frankly, people throughout the world, didn't see this coming, primarily because we framed the Cold War as being over. And so for us, it was over. But for certain people, it wasn't. And I do think that this is partly an attempt, and please, if you have something to add, I think partly the way to understand this war is it's Putin trying to kind of he's trying to kind of, I think, resolve in his mind the Cold War and kind of refight it in a way that will have him and Russia on the right side. And so I think, it's really important. I think, and I emphasize this a lot in my classes, the Cold War and the end of the Cold War, how it ended and when it ended, is super important to understanding this conflict, but not, and quite frankly, almost all of the major conflicts that are going on in the world right now. So, yeah.
I wonder if you might respond. I heard an interesting analysis that Putin is actually less like Stalin than he would see himself as one of the Romanov dynasty, perhaps, that we have to go even further back, pre-revolution or something, to understand his motivations and the way he sees the world. I wonder if you might react to that.
Yeah, I think, again, politics to me is all about kind of perception, but I can speak to like sort of my perception, and I think it's hard to get into Putin's mind, but I certainly think there's an aspect of that, for sure. I think he sees the Soviet Union and sees it as one of the great Russian empires, and there have been several Russian empires, and he sees the fall of the Soviet Union as one of the great tragedies of recent history, and he sees himself as, kind of like an emperor rebuilding that. And so, I think the psychology and the personal motivations of leaders like Putin are also really important to understand conflicts like this, yeah.
Olga, as you grew up as a child, what was that orientation like toward Russia? what did you and your neighbors and family and schoolmates, how did you see Russia as the Cold War was in our world winding down? What was that experience like for you?
Well, I'm old enough to grow up in Soviet Union, so I definitely remember the moment in 1991. I was a teenager when it collapsed and everything started falling apart. And I totally agree with Holly that it's still, I think, we see the kind of consequences of Cold War not being ended. And I also think that that huge geopolitical event of collapse of Soviet Union went pretty quietly. Like it just happened, and lots of people who lived in that huge country left wondering what happened because they didn't see that coming. It was very secretive, obviously, in a Soviet society like that. Nobody knew what was going on. It was announced it was no longer Soviet Union. I remember my parents watching. It was totally, people didn't know what to do with it. So I feel like in some way when those huge events are not processed, even on the human level, there is lingering consequences about how people perceive the rest of their lives. And many people in Russia right now, I feel like they're nostalgic about the times of Soviet Union, not necessarily in terms of ideology, a communistic ideology, but definitely of living in a huge empire, you know, this kind of imperialistic thinking, being part of something great, something big. When it was Soviet Union, Ukraine was one of the 15th republics, so it was not any hostility at that point, let's say. I would say that even in Ukraine, there was some suppression of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture. So you wouldn't have publications of Ukrainian authors. In Lviv, that is predominantly Ukrainian-speaking population, there were a majority of schools were Russian schools. And I went to school that the language was Russian there. So it's definitely, we saw that Russian language, Russian culture were dominating Ukrainian culture at that moment as a part of the Soviet Union. When Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine became an independent country, first, I think relationships were pretty good, and that's when we start seeing, Ukrainian language in higher education, Ukrainian traditions coming back, Ukrainian authors coming back, poets, philosophers, and so on, museums dedicated to those people. And I think for a while it was okay in that regard until Ukraine started orienting itself more with the Western ideology and Western values. Versus Russia, I felt like they were looking for their own kind of path. And what was striking to me is that as a young person at the time, I was not nostalgic about Soviet Union at all. I didn't think, why would somebody be nostalgic about it? I remember long lines for groceries for hour and, for just to buy bread. I remember all of that really well. It was really weird for me to see how those kind of moments, nostalgic moments, started coming up in Russia. They adopted national anthem, which is pretty much Soviet Union anthem, and they made it Russian Federation anthem. They have symbolics. They started bringing idea that Stalin was a very good ruler for some people, which that was just, I have a history of a family member who was killed by Stalin regime. So that was all shocking to me, seeing it from Ukraine, where they were going little by little, changing this rhetoric, changing this path for Russia. So I think that's kind of have changed over the years, since 1991 until this sad moment.
Holly, I wonder if we might go back to this question, because I listened to Olga talk about, that unresolved lingering effects where we didn't have a moment to mark that. And now here we are in the midst of this conflict and thinking about, well, what are those consequences now for the region, for those two countries, and for the world? Before we came in, we were chatting a little bit about some of those sort of existential impacts right out of the gate, right? Energy prices, food, et cetera. I wonder if you might just kind of comment on that in those concentric regions of impact around this conflict.
How much time do you have? I think again, if I can go a little bit back to my courses that I teach, I'm always trying to emphasize how the world is so interconnected, right? And even though the world and Ukraine, as we sit here in Grand Junction, feels so far away, it's affecting us, and sometimes in certain moments that's a hard sell, I think, to people to tell them that the world is so interconnected and a war far, far away might affect us, but I don't think that's a hard sell anymore. The ripple effect of this war, I think we're going to be seeing, even if it were to end fairly quickly, we're going to be seeing it for a very long time. Because just in terms of economics, it's disrupting supply chains, which were already disrupted due to COVID. And we are seeing that, of course, here in the United States with increased energy prices. But the places in the world that are going to, I think, see it the most quickly are places like the Middle East and Africa, which are some of the poorest countries in the world. This is where a lot of people get their oil. They get their oil from the Middle East as well as from Russia. This is where they get their bread. This is where they get a lot of their food. And of course, Africa, for a variety of reasons, is always an area that is in conflict, unstable. So this has I was mentioning Ethiopia earlier. Ethiopia is on the verge of a potential civil war. Some people have said it's in a civil war. You take now hunger and put that into a civil war, that's going to exacerbate that.
Holly, let's draw a straight line there, because I think
Sure.
maybe not everybody is tracking, but between Ukraine and Russia, I think conservatively, there's roughly a third of the world's wheat production, right? And so whether it's because of the conflict or because of sanctions, you've now got basically a third of the world's wheat production that has now been disrupted significantly, right?
Right,
And so maybe
exactly.
that straight line into who feels that downstream most acutely and what are the impacts of that.
Exactly, and I think what's important to understand is, obviously we here in the United States, we eat wheat, we eat bread, but places like Ethiopia, this is a absolute staple of their, everyday diet. This represents some of the cheaper stuff that you can buy and produce, and so, so this has the potential, again, because it's such an important staple for particularly poor places in the world. It has the potential to really exacerbate other, as I said, like existing conflicts. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Olga, you started to chat a little bit about this idea of moving toward the West, that Ukraine started to slowly kind of draw toward the West. And of course, Putin's narrative has been that that's been very different, right? It's been language around defeating Nazism, which is odd considering Ukraine's president is Jewish. But I wonder if you might comment on trying to, for those of us that are sitting back and trying to make sense of, you've got Putin's narrative over here, and then you've got this other narrative coming out of NATO. What's your sense that sort of rank and file Ukrainians are, what is their orientation right now and how they're thinking about those two opposing forces?
Right. I listened to some interviews recently, and it was an interesting phrase said about Ukraine and Europe and Russia relationship. And they said that Ukraine was in love with Europe, and Europe was in love with Russia, and Russia hated them both. It's obviously, very exaggerated, simplified phrase. But Ukraine started kind of developing this identity with a very core value of freedom to its country, because Ukraine's history rooted into fight for freedom. It was fight against Ottoman Empire, against Russian Empire, against Soviet Union at first. I mean, it's a complicated history, and the struggle to gain independence, to hold independence, was kind of written in the history of Ukraine. And that's why I think, since it's the freedom itself, kind of a right to decide your own destiny within the Europe. And at the same time, having a good economic relationship with Russia would be very beneficial, because obviously there's a shared history, there is a shared economical ties. It would be profitable for both countries. but the clash of ideologies kind of went deeper and deeper. And I feel like in all narratives that Ukraine was trying to move towards the West, we always hear Russia saying, oh, they were bought by the United States, they were bought by some Western politicians. And it completely denies Ukraine the right to actually identify themselves as a country, as an independent country in Europe. And at the point of ideology and what Ukraine wants, Russia does not seem all that attractive, because with all the challenges that Ukraine as a young democracy has, it still has some freedoms that people enjoy. For example, free elections. You know, in the time span that Russia had one president, Ukraine had 5. And the last election of Volodymyr Zielinski, he was going against incumbent president, and he won with like 73, I think, %. So it was not a rigged election. It was really people elected the person they wanted to lead their country. And Ukraine, seeing everything that's going on in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of opposing politicians that simply disappear in Russia, they didn't see it as an attractive option. So definitely they were trying to realign themselves more with the Western values and European values. And they were striving to get into European Union for a long time, and it was a critical moment when pretty much the draft of the agreement was ready, and at the time President Viktor Yanukovych was supposed to sign it, and then he was called to Russia for a meeting with, I'm simplifying, for the meeting with Vladimir Putin. And after that, he came back and he didn't sign it, and it started the next kind of uprising in Ukraine, which led to ousting Yanukovych as the president and a new kind of new wave in Ukraine, because there was a moment like we as people want this, and the president unilaterally declined us this opportunity after Russia put some pressure on him. So that was kind of a beginning, and that was time when they annexed Crimea, and it was time when they started conflict in the eastern region of Ukraine and Donbass. So in this kind of situation, where Ukraine sees itself, I think right now there is no doubt. I don't think any country should be just molded in some other kind of ideas. Ukraine will be its own country, but definitely they value Western values, value of freedom of speech, freedom to decide their own destiny.
Do you think as Ukraine is currently constituted in terms of the geography, and when you overlay the Ukrainian language and history and culture, are the current borders roughly where you think are appropriate, where Ukraine would say, yeah, that's the appropriate place for our boundaries to be? Or does Russia have any legitimate claims over those eastern regions?
Well, the Europe overall, and Holly, please correct me on that, the borders have been redrawn many, many times, and the last one was after World War II. So historically, actually, it's in Ukraine where the Kievskaya Rus started. That was Kiev, and where baptism of Rus back then happened. So Ukraine was there first. Before, we say that Kiev was there way before Moscow was there. So in that regard, I think to compromise on territorial integrity, that's kind of a slippery slope. It is hard to say at the moment where this war is going to lead. And certainly there will be some tough decisions on Volodymyr Zielinski part. What is, victory looks like? If there is a victory, does it mean that some, land of Ukraine will be lost? It's hard to say. But Ukraine is multi-ethnic country, so there's definitely, people ask me that a lot. There's not like there is a clear definition, this is the ethnic Russian, this is the ethnic Ukrainian, because many, many people truly have all of that mixed in them because of the history of those two countries, because of forced movement between the Soviet Union when people were assigned jobs from one republic into the other, and that's where they would settle quite often and have families. So you cannot say that Ukrainians are only Ukrainians who are ethnically Ukrainian. because we do have Jewish population, we have Crimean Tatars who are not very happy in the current situation at all. And then we have a lot of people who are ethnically Russian or partially ethnically Russian. If they identify themselves as Ukrainians, as citizens of that country, that's what defines them, not definitely some kind of territorial affiliation or the language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hence the reason my question, because I think a lot of us, we read the conflict and it's easy to sort of boil it down to this cartoonish caricature, but it's so much more complex as you've described. Do you, Holly, as you've thought about the ongoing conflict between, and I love that, who's in love with whom between Ukraine, Russia, and Europe, and chatting about this thinking of how Europe and NATO has thought about Russia with trade and maybe convenient stories and narratives they've told themselves about engaging on energy and some of those things. But share with us for a minute your perspective on how Europe has been engaging with Russia and how that has maybe been changed and obstructed now.
Yeah, I mean, I think since the end of the Cold War, since 1991, Europe, certainly once the Cold War ended, that really opened up the possibility for, I mean, the European Union had always been around since 1956, but when the Cold War ended, that kind of created the opportunity for the European Union to really flourish. But despite NATO, which has been there, of course, since 1945, and besides the European Union, I mean, just looking at a map, Europe can't get rid of Russia, right? I mean, even if they really wanted to. And so Europe and the European Union as kind of a whole has had really no choice but to at least engage Russia. And I think that's kind of been the dance. They have the European Union. NATO didn't go away, even with the end of the Cold War, at least from our perspective. And but Europe is like all countries need things, right? And Russia has oil and gas. And I don't, from a European perspective, it made a lot of sense to get involved with Gazprom and to start, buying Russian oil and gas, not because they always have, but also because, it makes sense to engage countries, even if they're not particularly friendly, even if you've had an intense history with those countries. It makes sense to trade with them. That we trade with China, for example, and there's kind of a perspective and a theory in political science that says trade makes maybe not peace, but at least stable relationships. And so I think that was a very strategic thing for Russia, for Europe to do, to engage with Russia, at least economically, to have a stable relationship. Because they're, again, if you look at a map, they're very close to one another, and Europe is kind of smashed into this very tiny continent, very close to Russia. So you have to find a way to engage. But at the same time, there was the multiple layers of European Union, former Soviet republics that, are kind of smashed in the middle, like Ukraine, like Moldova, Lithuania. So, but I think, they had to find a way. And that was, I think, one of the better ways. Politically, it was more difficult. Economically, it's easier.
So I want to pull on this thread a little bit around energy before we talk about information, because I think that's another fascinating sort of sub-thread in this conversation. But, the interesting thing is it seems like in the West, we have been really focused on things like carbon emissions and climate change, and it's almost as if Vladimir Putin has said, that's adorable. Would you care for some more gas? And built a bunch of pipelines specifically so he could shut them off. And it appears to me there's been some kind of a redux of some realpolitik for the West to understand they are playing a different game than we are in this regard. Is that a fair assessment?
I mean, yes, I think, I'm not sure that, and perhaps I'm naive on this issue, but I think that, I'm not totally sure I would say that Putin specifically built these pipelines in order to shut them off. I think that that became a convenient thing now that that the war has happened. So that has become an easy way to kind of nudge, and kind of push Europe around. But yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, and I think Europe has its own, European Union has its own climate change agreement. They do a lot of carbon trading agreements in Europe. So I think, in some way Europe has tried to manage its carbon emissions. It's tried to come up with green energy. I lived in Germany for a very long time. Every single despite Germany being a very cloudy country, every single roof in Germany has, at least in the bigger cities, has a solar panel. So I think, Europe has been trying to move away from oil and gas, but just as we know here in the United States, it's not that easy, because our entire economic infrastructure is based around oil and gas. And so again, but from a more political perspective, continuing to engage Russia, at least with oil and gas, was a way to keep Russia as at least a somewhat friendly, ally, and as we saw, that didn't really work. But yeah, I think, Europe has engaged in the climate change debate in a kind of a different way than we have here. But they haven't been able to, and that was never the goal, I think, to completely divest themselves from oil and gas. Yeah.
So before we move to some Q&A, and I think we have probably some folks that have some questions about this conversation, but Olga, I want to go back to one other topic, and that is, you talked about this idea of looking east toward Russia if you're Ukrainian and seeing politicians who simply go away and presidents who don't go away, and a totally different flow of information, which is, of course, ironic being neighbors, and yet here you are in Lviv with access to the internet and across the border, something very different. I wonder if you might give us a flavor of what you've observed in that regard and what it is like to be seeing that kind of disruption and disparate information streaming through to people.
I think for me personally, it is a very sad part of this war is the information war, which always exists, right, in any war. But it became personal to many people in Ukraine because many people, I am probably exception, we don't have relatives in Russia, but many people have relatives in Russia. And there would be phone conversations, and Ukrainian relatives would say, our city is being bombed, we're hiding in the basement for several days, and totally hear denial of every single fact that they voiced to their relatives in Russia. Because I feel like society...
You're saying, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you're saying that their relatives, their cousins across the border were saying that's not true, you're not being bombed. That's not true.
Yeah, exactly,
Wow.
exactly. I know of people who actually had those conversations, and they said, this is not true, it's Ukrainian forces doing it because they don't have precise weapons. The most kind of outrageous excuses for that. And that's heartbreaking because I know people who lost lifetime friendship, they lost connection with their relatives. And it is kind of devastating because you're trying to survive an extremely stressful event the best way you can, and you lose your support in some of the very close people who just live in that country that invaded yours. But I think in terms of information in Russia, it is a complicated topic because we do see there, like we probably see in most countries, a generational gap because older people, they watch state TV. That's what they do. They don't go on the internet. They don't have Instagram or Facebook. They watch state TV. And probably a week after the war started, Russian government shut down all opposing, all kind of alternative in the point of view, so more open media sources. That was one radio station, it was very popular. It was one newspaper who published stuff not only aligned with the propaganda, and then one TV station. And they closed all three within 1 week. So all people have right now is just a state TV channels with the propaganda cranked up to the maximum. Younger people, many of them download VPN, which is a software that allows you to change IP address, as I understand it, and they can avoid blocking of the internet. Like, let's say Instagram is not allowed, but they can use VPN and see it. So in that case, I think that many people, unfortunately, due to this kind of brainwashing slowly over the years, and specifically since 2014, that's been constantly imposed on them, they do support this war. I absolutely convinced that many Russian people support this war because they believe what they hear. I think there is a very small vocal minority that expresses at the huge risk to their lives, and they say something publicly, specifically people like artists or journalists, because honestly, if you say something that Russian government considers going against their information about the war, there is a 15 years in prison as a possible consequence for that. So it's hard to blame people when they're not speaking out. Because we know that in Russian prison, people also don't survive sometimes. It's not a good situation. And I think there is probably a silent minority that doesn't support but doesn't say anything publicly. And then there's very active in support group of people. I cannot tell you the percentages of that, who very actively support the war and post the most mean things about the atrocities in Bucha were done by Ukrainian military forces, and I think many of them truly believe that, and that's the sad fact about information war. Yeah.
So appreciate you being willing to sit and have this conversation with us. I wonder if there's questions in the audience that we might be able to take from any of our panelists.
Olga Germans, was that with Ukraine or was that actually in Russia? Because I know there was parts of Ukraine that actually welcomed Hitler because they were German, plus they could now worship and things like that they couldn't do under Stalin. So the Germans that Catherine the Great moved over, was that in Russia or is that what is now present day Ukraine?
Sorry, can I clarify just a little bit?
A whole bunch of Germans were asked by Catherine the Great to move over and
Oh,
work the wheat
got it.
fields. I just wonder, is that what is now present-day Russia, or is that what is now present-day Ukraine?
It's
Or both?
Got it, sorry. Yes, it's present-day Russia. It was around Volga River. Yes, there was the settlement of Germans. Yeah, it was in the present-day Russia.
Question in the back here.
Just kind of going back to you said the Cold War being over. When this war is over, quote unquote, when do you kind of think you'll see more normal economics, so to speak, with the wheat and kind of other growing things, and kind of Netflix losing over 700,000 subscribers in their first quarter just from Russia and Ukraine? So just kind of wondering when, how long, kind of so to speak.
No, it's a good question. I wish I had a crystal ball, but I don't. I think the way, at least in my view, when Russia first invaded in late February, and then sanctions were put on Russia almost very, very quickly, and much more forcefully than I think some people expected. I think there was this sense of, and then there was some news coming out that Russia, their military wasn't doing as well, and they had been pushed back out of Kyiv. I think there was kind of a sense, at least that was my sense, that maybe this thing will actually end much more quickly than we expected. And the fact of the matter is that even short wars, at least if you kind of look at the history of warfare in the world, tend to last several years. And so I personally, given the multiple layers of this, given the NATO, given the European Union, given all the kind of interests at stake, and given the fact that, as Olga has mentioned, Putin is kind of a one-man show right now in Russia. I mean, he has built himself into he's really consolidated power for over the course of about the last 20 years. And he doesn't have a good out right now. I mean, he started this thing, he's kind of staked his entire kind of historical reputation on this. So he doesn't have a good out. So I would not expect this thing to end anytime soon, unfortunately. And therefore, in terms of getting back to normal, again, what is normal? How do we perceive normal versus what Russia perceives as normal? I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. Yeah.
So in the news a lot, oh, we get a microphone. Okay. So, so in the news a lot, being here, a lot of us are just trying to figure out what's going on, right? And I think there's a lot of different frames being thrown around about, how to interpret this. And as President Marshall mentioned, Putin has made some claims about Nazism. We've seen some stuff about some Nazi ideology with Ukrainian nationalism. I was just curious if any of you had some perspective on that and what the role of that frame is in this whole issue. Is that aimed at the Western world? Is that aimed at just convincing more Russian nationalists to support what's going on, or, yeah?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. So in many propaganda points, there's usually some kind of grains of truth that is twisted and exaggerated. So where I think it's coming from is that during World War II, it is a known historical fact that some of Ukrainian militia units were collaborating with Nazis. It was mostly in the west part of Ukraine, and some of them stayed for the duration of the war. Some of them turned against Nazis because their goal was to become independent. They were trying to make allies with whoever could help them get rid of Soviets. However, at the same time, 1,650,000 Ukrainian soldiers died in World War II fighting Nazis. And close to 8 million civilians died during that time because Ukraine at the moment was part of the Soviet Union, and Ukrainians paid dearly for that victory with their lives. So some of those narratives come from that fact that was some collaboration in some part of some militia units. However, it's probably, we should mention that most of the European countries had some kind of a support for Nazi regimes and had some collaborators throughout. So it's not like it's unique to Ukraine in this particular case. But to say that what Ukraine did in World War II is absolutely disrespectful to close to 2 million of people who lost their lives fighting Nazis in Ukraine and liberating Ukraine from the occupation. So in terms of modern day, like any country, there are some extremes on political spectrum, and there are some extreme right groups in Ukraine as well. We have them in this country also. And it's true for any country. It's true for Germany, but what you need to look at is that does this group has power in the government? And if you look at Ukraine political system, it's multi-party political system, and extreme right party gained 2% in the whole, parliament. So it's absolutely insignificant to the decision-making in the government of Ukraine. Can somebody use it as a propaganda point? Absolutely, and that's what they're doing. So after Zielinski won the election, his party won the absolute majority in the parliament of Ukraine.
I might just add to that a little bit. This metaphor, if you will, or this analogy to Hitler has become kind of almost boring in my view, because you see it often. You see it all the time. And so I think when you ask about who is the audience for this, I think it's everyone, because I think it's directed towards the domestic Russian audience, but it's also directed towards the Western audience, because Nazi and Hitler have like a very You know, it's such an emotional response, even so many decades later, right? But many leaders have used that analogy of Hitler and World War II to justify warfare. So again, it's not surprising and almost a little bit kind of trite at this point, I think, but that not to dismiss what's happening, but this is a continuous thing that I think we're going to see all the time.
I'm curious about the, I can't tell if this is, is it on? All right. I'm curious about sort of the juxtaposition of leadership between Zielinski and Putin. So with Zielinski, you've got a guy who was formerly a comedian, an actor, a dancer, and somebody who is much more emotive. And then with the latter, with Putin, you have somebody who is a lot more of that stereotype macho, you know, posing with photos of him wrestling shirtless with bears and on horses and firing guns and that kind of thing. And because Zielinski decided to stay and has been such an outspoken voice with trying to appeal to the United States, the EU, NATO, and so forth, what do you think his decision to stay has done for the psyche of Ukrainians and sort of this, and fueling the will to fight and to help sort of mitigate and stave off the invasion of Russia?
I think it was a significant moment for him, and you're right, he was a comedian. He was trained as a lawyer, actually. He has a law degree, but he became a very successful comedian starting from his university years, because it was a very well-known competition of comedy clubs between universities, and that's how he started, and he built this entertainment empire. I think many people did not take him seriously for that particular reason. However, he was extremely successful businessman, and he built it from scratch. Like, he didn't have any investment, obviously, from his parents or anything like that. I think his decision to stay changed many things, and I think it set the tone for the rest of the leadership, and not only leadership in Kiev, but also leadership in different cities. Because what we have seen during this war is that mayors of the city becoming kind of like key figures to coordinate anti-war efforts. And since he stayed, there was kind of a tone set for everybody else that we're staying and we're fighting this war. And I think it was a surprise even to many Ukrainians at the moment. But many people underestimate him and his ability to lead. And I think he definitely rose up to the occasion.
I'm also reflected as I've watched that there's some sort of deep historical truths between fighting for something that's worth fighting for, and you drove at this early on, this idea of Ukraine continuing over generations to try and fight for that sense of self-determination and autonomy. And it seems to me that in some ways this has become a proxy war for an illiberal world order versus a more liberal world order. Are we going to stand for freedoms and individual dignity and individual worth, or are we going to let the world descend into strong men and autocracy? And it does seem like in some ways that was part of what we watched with Zielinski, was digging in and saying, no, this is worth fighting for, and whatever we're running against is actually less fearful than what we have to stay and fight for, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's another question over here. Oh, okay, I've got one over here.
My question is kind of related to Ukraine's own autonomy and kind of like how it will be affected by the war. And like, do you think you guys are going to lose any autonomy after the war? Or do you think you'll be able to hold on to that? Do you think there's a possibility that the people there will lose that ability to kind of vote for their own presidents and like think for themselves if Russia is actually able to like invade? Or do you think Russia will allow you guys to kind of remain your own people because of the pressure on them from NATO?
Did you get that over?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say right now, but I don't think and I obviously have been reading a lot and watching news closely. It doesn't seem like a complete invasion is likely at this moment. I think the original idea was that they would take over Ukraine within like 48 to 72 hours, pretty much get rid of current government and instill their puppet government. And in this case, it would be ruled the way they want it to be ruled. But at this point, I think the patriotism in Ukraine I have never seen like that in my life. People who are typically Eastern Europeans, kind of skeptical, kind of, minding their own business, thinking their own thing. I have never seen among all my friends, my relatives, such a strong patriotism and willingness to fight till the end. So I can't even fathom the thought that it's gonna end in complete invasion, and because so far it doesn't seem like it's going that way. But I think everything will be decided primarily at this point probably on the battlefield, as horrible as it sounds. And then hopefully some of that will lead to more meaningful negotiations for peace in the future. But what it's going to look like, I don't think anybody can predict at this point.
I think it's also kind of worth noting that this isn't the first time that Russia or Putin specifically has done something similar to this. I mean, there are lots of kind of disputed and semi-autonomous regions that have kind of fallen under Russian orbit, like South Ossetia in Georgia, Transnistria in Moldova. And again, all of this is from the legacy of the Cold War. And none of those regions, however, have become complete, just absorbed into Russian territory. Even Belarus, which is largely kind of at the moment, the government is largely a Russian puppet, is still kind of an autonomous region, right? So I think we can look to some of those other examples to see what maybe Russia or Putin specifically had in mind. But again, I think he bit off a little bit more than he could chew with Ukraine. Ukraine's a little bit of a different animal with a different history than South Ossetia and Transnistria and some of these other territories. And so I doubt that he will be able to have quite the same level of control and, run a puppet government in Ukraine like he's been able to do in some other similar situations.
This is for Holly. This is like a two-part question, but when does, there's been some news about nukes being Putin. When does foreign policy stop and military moves in for NATO and America? And what is China's whole thing in this whole thing? Because historically, China and Russia never got along, and all of a sudden now they're buddies. So, you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, nukes definitely are a big question, which is, again, very interesting because when the Cold War, again, ended for us, the nuclear kind of question was off the table, right? It kind of felt like that was no longer a big threat. But again, from maybe a Russian perspective, again, the Cold War didn't really end. And I don't remember exactly how many days it was after the invasion, but it was very quickly that Putin put the nuclear forces on high alert, which I think rightly made everybody nervous. It certainly made me nervous. I didn't think he was actually going to nuke, anybody, but even just putting them on high alert is, symbolism. And so, yeah, nukes definitely play a big role in this conflict, which we didn't even really touch on. I mean, there was a whole nuclear arsenal that was in Ukraine while it was the Soviet Union, right? And this was a big part of how the Soviet Union broke up, was who is going to get those nukes that were under Soviet control but were staged in Kazakhstan and Ukraine. And part of the kind of agreement as the Cold War, or as the Soviet Union dissolved, was to move those nuclear weapons out of the places like Ukraine and Kazakhstan and put them back into Russian territory. And so nukes play a role in the history, and they certainly, I mean, again, there's a kind of another theory in political science that says that two nuclearized countries won't go to war with each other, which is why the US and the USSR never went to direct war with each other during the Cold War. And so, you know, this might renew discussions. We have something in the world called a Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is supposed to keep countries, except for the big 5 countries, from developing nuclear weapons. This could restart that conversation about the certain countries wanting nukes to protect themselves. And of course, China, as you mentioned, is one of those big 5 countries that under this agreement is allowed to have nuclear weapons. And yeah, your larger question about China and Russia, you're right, they didn't get along strangely during the Cold War. Now they're kind of, I mean, they've gotten along better, but I think China has rethought its friendship with Russia recently because of this war, because it's not quite going as well as they had expected. So I think China has backed away, but still, this has larger implications, again, for, like, you know, Taiwan, for example, and so I could go on and on. But yeah, I mean, this has really, I think, what is really important about this crisis is that it has recalibrated how a lot of countries, China, Russia, the Middle East, United States, NATO, it's kind of recalibrated how we see the geopolitics of the world, and nukes play a big role in that.
If I can just add real quick to the Budapest Memorandum you mentioned, when Ukraine signed that agreement, it was Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus and Ukraine had the biggest accumulation of nuclear weapon. And when they gave it all away, it was promised Ukraine that they would have territorial integrity. And then 2 guarantors in that agreement were Russia and the United States. And I think
UK.
The UK, yes. So that just, it was, I think, seeing that that agreement didn't mean anything is not good for this decrease of nuclear proliferation, because a smaller country, just like Holly said, will look at the situation and said, well, if Ukraine had nukes, would this war have happened? And it's not a good path for this world to have.
Yeah, I mean, you saw North Korea marched its nukes out on the streets recently as well. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's renewing that conversation.
So this morning, I listen to BBC quite frequently. I just like getting my news in an accent. And a passing comment this morning was that some people have begun to notice and be concerned, or notice Putin's health. And we're fond of putting leaders like that on health watch. You know, could they die? And so it brought to my mind the thought experiment of how much of this would be in place and happening if in fact Putin was not the one-man show. So let's just suppose that he dies tomorrow. How much, and not that you can get inside his mind, but how successful has his propaganda and information been? Has it been successful enough that someone else will just take the place of that in that vacuum? And a variation on that question is, if he had died a year ago, would this have even happened? And so, how much of this is the will of Putin versus? That's my question. How much of this is a war of Putin versus Ukraine versus, quote, Russia versus Ukraine?
I mean, I think it was certainly Putin's plan. I think he's been planning this for a long time. So I don't think it's as if, you know, he woke up one day and said, you know, this sounds fun. I think this has been in the works for a very long time. And again, I think you can trace it all the way again back to the end of the Cold War, back to 1990, and this kind of humiliation of losing the Cold War and having the great Soviet Union dissolve. And so I think this has been in the minds of not just Putin, but Russian political elites for a very, very long time. At the same time, even though this was Putin's decision and he's been planning it for a very long time, I don't think it's like Putin's war, because as much as a one-man show as he is, as much power he has consolidated, no man can consolidate so much power that he can do just anything he wants, right? The only reason that this war, he might be a little bit unhealthy, but he's not dumb. And he would not have done this if he thought that he didn't have at least enough Russian support. And I think any leader has to take that public support into consideration, and they do. And I think he knew that there would be some opposition, but I think he knew that he had enough support because he's been kind of building this nationalism for a very long time. Yeah, I don't know, do you want to add to that?
No, I completely agree. I also think they are in a situation when the propaganda was so powerful and effective that it took a life of its own. And they don't necessarily control that, because now when they hyped up their population, especially a certain part of the population, how can they deliver anything less than a victory? How are they going to sell their military failures, let's say, in Ukraine? So I think it's a dangerous situation, and lessons should be drawn from that, because when this idea exaggerated and pushed on people year after year after year, it's hard to control narratives because people become obsessed with this. I think if he died tomorrow, like you said, he probably would be chaos at some point. In terms of propaganda, people we see on Russian TV, I think those are not necessarily ideological people. I think they will change narrative. I think many of them do it for the money. Not all of them truly believe that. I think their business elites definitely are in shock, but they have zero influence on him because he kept throughout his time business and politics quite separately. So all those billionaires and in sanctions, I don't think they have any influence on his decision making, but they're certainly not happy with all of that, I assume.
So I'm curious on, and I don't know if you can answer this because we're not in the mind of Putin, but what's his end game? Like, should other former Soviet Union countries be worried that this could happen to them too?
I think they should be worried, but I do also think that Ukraine has a very symbolic significance to Putin and to, again, other Russian political elites. So I'm not sure I would be worried that he would invade tomorrow, but I would be worried, and that's another reason why countries like Estonia and Lithuania and those Baltic countries joined NATO, and why it seems like, at least as of this morning, Finland hadn't joined yet, but maybe they had. I think the decision was supposed to be made today. So I think they should be worried. But what is Putin's end game? Honestly, and again, please, tell me correct me if I'm wrong, but I honestly think that he made a strategic blunder that he's not alone in this camp, that a lot of political leaders have made in the history of the world, which is an overflated sense of himself, an overflated sense of his military ability. And I think he made a very strategic miscalculation. It's, as Olga mentioned, I think he thought this would be over and done with in a few weeks, maybe. And I think that was his end game, was to just kind of roll in there, talk about denazification, and he banked on the fact that NATO, because of kind of apathy in the West, because of the recent kind of pullout in Afghanistan, he believed that NATO would not respond and that the West would not respond. And on that, he's kind of, at least militarily, been correct. But I think he thought this was going to be fairly easy, and I think his end game was to kind of, just, maybe not immediately, but kind of slowly, take over, as many parts of Ukraine as he possibly could. And to be honest, he probably will get, I don't know, we'll see, but I think he's already basically taken over the Donbass, the Crimea. Mariupol seems to be pretty much on his watch list. So I think that probably some territory will be ceded. Now, then there's Transnistria, right, that is kind of wants to be part of Russia. So I think he probably will get some of that, but I think his end goal was to have a much bigger control. But yeah.
No, I don't have a lot to add, but I don't know what is his end game. But I agree, I think he made a huge mistake. And I think when someone is in power for so long, they stop listening to advisors, or at least advisors with different opinion than yours. And he eliminated all people who disagree. And he made this very public meeting for all his government officials, where he pretty much called them like children like in school, to the microphone, and told them, do you support it? Ask them, do you support this? And they all had to say yes. So he's kind of like, you're all in it now. So it's hard to say what his end game is now. But I don't think he predicted that.
I would make one other observation about it, which is we try and frame him in a Western mindset. And so we think in terms of self-interest, we think in terms of profit, we think in terms of all these things that in sort of a Western mindset makes sense to us. And I think it's hard for us to flip the idea that somebody would damn the torpedoes, risk everything for the glory of an empire that's been gone for 120 years. And it seems to me that he's made decision after decision after decision that we continue, NATO, the EU, the United States, we continue to misinterpret because we're not really understanding what's motivating him, and it isn't money. And we sort of continue to miss that concept, and he continues to use all of the tools at his discretion to weaponize those things toward the both. Obviously he has enriched himself along the way in a way that's maybe unprecedented in history, but we are fundamentally playing by different rules than he is, it seems to me, and we continue to misjudge the rules that he is playing by in his own head. There's another question right here.
Yeah, so from what I understand, the U.S. has been a pretty consistent supplier of arms and funding weapons and whatnot to the Ukrainian side of the conflict. And then I also understand that the EU has been relatively open to accepting asylum seekers and granting them refugee status in a lot of the neighboring countries, spanning all the way over to even the western side of Europe. So Olga, I'm curious about what you think the international community ought to be doing on top of what they're already doing to support the Ukrainian side of this.
Yeah, I think definitely military support from the United States, that's what can make difference on the battlefield and can make a difference in the outcome of this war. And I am not a military expert, so I can't speak of how many of each type of military equipment they need, but it seems like there is never enough. But in terms of, and humanitarian support, it's been incredible. I think it's been unprecedented to see how refugees were welcomed in specifically closest country in Poland, because I think they accepted over 2 million people just in Poland. And people with expired passports, people with no passports were welcomed just when they crossed the border. And Ukraine and Poland had its own complicated history, and seeing that they are completely embraced Ukrainians at this moment was very heartwarming. And they made it very easy to go to this particular country, versus some countries also open their doors, but it's just a little bit more of a bureaucratic, I guess, delay in accepting refugees. But I think everyone in Ukraine is forever grateful for this support, because I don't know what it would be, frankly, at this point without it. So it's hard to foresee the needs, and definitely when we see cities like Mariupol, that was a very green, very successful economically city, seeing it completely destroyed. How does one rebuild that? But again, when we looking at what's going on in Ukraine, it's not the buildings we grieve for. We grieve for people and civilians that now are in thousands that lost their lives. So the need will be tremendous after all of this is done for rebuilding Ukraine, for, I see us being in healthcare, for mental health, because I can even see the effect of that in my closer relatives, what a war does to human and to their psychology and then traumatic things that people see and live through.
I want to thank my colleagues on stage for this thoughtful conversation. I want to thank our studio audience for joining us, and those of you at home who've tuned in. This is part of the CMU Civic Forum, conversations that matter, and we just are grateful for Olga and Holly. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you to our studio audience here for the great questions and the good discussion. We'll look forward to having you again next time, and thank you for joining us.